I think you know Rasmus very well by now. He is from Archaeolinguistic Research Group at MPI in Jena, and Rob is from the Department of Linguistic and Cultural Evolution of the MPI in Jena, and he's a historical linguist, focuses on Indo-European languages. And yes, we have an exciting session about Indo-European homeland.
All right, thank you very much, Ayaka. I'm very happy to be co-teaching this with my friend and colleague, Rob, and we'll be introducing you to one of the most persistent problems within historical linguistics, and in many ways, one of the founding problems. So what is all the fuss about? Still in 2021, we've been having this discussion for almost 2 centuries now. So it is indeed a persistent problem, but we're here to reassure you that progress is being made. And just when you thought you didn't have to care because you work in a different region, you work in a different period of time, we have to tell you that Indo-European languages are pretty much spoken across the globe now, but also historically, they had a very widespread in Eurasia. It's also a testing ground for new methods in historical linguistics because it's so well researched. And one of the reasons that it is so well researched is obviously a lot of historical coincidences, but the fact of the matter is we have 10 different branches that each have developed for 5,000 years in their separate directions. So discounting all the different independent languages in different branches, we're looking at least 50,000 years of well-researched language development. So there's a lot to take from, a lot to learn, and don't worry, we won't cover it all today, but we'll give you the basics and let you know where the debate stands today. So apparently there's a thing when Indo-Europeanists do an introduction to their field, we have to tell you that the scientific study of the Indo-European languages started with Sir William Jones, who was an Englishman in India in 1786. He said that Latin and Greek, languages that he obviously knew because he was a well-educated European in those days, and Sanskrit, which he had learned because he needed to learn about the judicial and social systems of India. Those 3 languages were so similar that they must have sprung from some common source, and that common source is Proto-Indo-European, and there is we all agree to that part. So really a brief recap was that in the late 19th century, the neo-grammarians, primarily in Germany and also in Denmark, we see Carl Werner here at the bottom picture, made the famous statement that there can be no exception without a rule. So that is, we have to have regular sound laws to establish language genealogies. Otherwise, there are other processes at play. And then for the rest of the time, in pretty much the 20th century, the big breakthroughs were that we had Anatolian and Tocharian discovered and deciphered and determined to be Indo-European languages. So they had to be fit in what we previously knew, or what was previously known. And then a lot of debates, a lot of cross-referencing with archaeology and, as we'll get to towards the end, genetics as well. So this is what you're in for. We'll give you all the basics, the 10 branches, and we'll talk about how we have tried historically to find the homeland, and then give you the up-to-date state-of-the-art where we can do the full triangulation of the 3 fields with the recent breakthrough in ancient DNA, and then also focus on the problems that still remain and where it's really interesting to get new perspectives and where we're still having a lot of discussion, which is obviously very interesting to be a part of. Which is Anatolian, which is the oldest branch. And then there are some other problems because once we shed more light on different regions and we get more chronologies, then other questions arise and we can add more granularity to these issues. So basically, there are 10 branches and 2 of them have a very clear early bifurcation. And then there are a lot of fragmentary or insecure languages that are ancient, they're extinct, but we found them in inscriptions, but not enough so we can properly determine where they belong. Oh, sorry, that was a bit too quick. Here it is on a map. Notice that we're missing Albanian. I don't know if you see my cursor, but if you don't, then own in on the Balkans, where Albanian is spoken right to the north west of Greek. Otherwise, all the major branches are mentioned here as in the historical spread, not the modern spread. Obviously, Indo-European languages now cover pretty much the entire globe, where there are people. Most of the places in European languages are also spoken. But I'll give it over to Rob now, who will go into a little bit more detail.
Hey folks, yeah, thanks Rasmus. Thanks to all of you for sticking with the summer school for so long. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I just want to encourage you to post questions or any kind of other queries or comments in the chat. We can't really answer them as we go because of the way we're sharing the screen, but we'll be hanging out later to answer questions or to do any kind of discussion. And we'll be hanging out in the Gather Town till the cats come home. So thanks for being here, and yeah, let's continue with our 10 wonderful branches. This little chart here shows you the attestation of these languages. No, this is when the time we have written sources from, so not the time when these languages existed. People were obviously speaking Slavic well before they actually started writing Slavic, right? All the way at the top, you can see Anatolian, which is one of those language families I think people are less familiar with, simply because it's been extinct for many, many centuries. And also close to the middle, we have Tocharian, also not very well known, also extinct. The other branches I think you'll be more familiar with, but you can see how Anatolian crops up around 1800 to 1700 BCE, whereas Baltic and Albanian don't get written down until the late medieval ages in Europe, right? Okie dokes. So now we're going to take you through these one by one. Don't be afraid. We'll try and make it quick and painless. We always have like a little example of some of the written sources on the right and the words for water, seven, and cow, just so you can have a nice little image of how similar these languages are and how dissimilar. So we'll start with number one, which is Anatolian. I just said it's the most ancient branch of Indo-European by attestation, but it died out pretty soon after the beginning of the Common Era. It's almost exclusively clay tablets, especially in cuneiform, and all from central and western Anatolia. The culture and also the genetics and archaeology of the speakers seems relatively usual for like the Near East. There's not a lot of discontinuity there. Anatolian is pretty unusual in that it lacks a lot of features that all the other Indo-European languages share, which we'll get into later. That's some interesting evidence to know for. Second of all, we got Tocharian, also extinct, only written in the mid-1st century CE and spoken exclusively in the Tarim Basin in Xinjiang in the western modern China. A lot of the texts are Buddhist of nature or regarding trade and such things. So we get interactions with Chinese, with Indic languages because of the Buddhism, with Aranek. Tocharian is also kind of unusual in some ways, which is probably due to contact with other non-Indo-European languages, specifically Uralic. With Tocharian, we have a pretty good idea of where the speakers came from. Both genetically and archaeologically, we're reasonably sure that they came from the Eurasian steppe. And you're going to hear the word steppe, steppe, steppe a lot more today. Now, Germanic is what we're using at the moment. Relatively late with attestation, seems to have spread from the western Baltic coast or southern Sweden, and very much in the same macro region as Celtic and Slavic, with a lot of interactions there. Germanic is late, but it has a lot of really neat ancient traits, which we Germanic speakers aren't really that aware of. And for Germanic, we also have a very good idea that the speakers of Germanic languages historically have always had a very strong genetic signature from the Eurasian steppe, and it's part of the core to the Ware complex, which we'll be talking a bit more following. Italic is the language family to which Latin belongs, and Latin and all its descendants. But there used to be also other languages other than Latin, which became extinct when Latin spread, and they all switched over to Latin, right? So Italic has some features in common with Celtic, which is coming up next, and with Germanic, which we just had. So we have a decent idea about Italic in this way, but in genetics and archaeology, it's not as clear as Germanic, for instance. We have step ancestry, as we have in most European groups, but it's not really that clear. And archaeologically, we're not really sure where the speakers of Italic come from. Not quite as easy. Celtic, like I just said, was once spoken basically throughout all of Central and Western Europe, but only on the British Isles and Brittany did the languages survive, into the Common Era, really. Celtic interacts heavily with Germanic and Italic. It's also part of this Cordillera complex and also of the Bell-Beaker complex, which is further west in Europe. Celtic is often, often said to have a lot of really odd features for an Indo-European language, but that's really confined to insular Celtic. So, stuff like Irish, Cornish, Welsh, and Breton, and the old continental languages are actually really boring and old-fashioned as Indo-European languages go. Here hatched, you can see the Cordillera horizon. That's an archaeological region, basically, and you can see how Germanic, Celtic, Baltic, Slavic, and also Italic perhaps are part of that, archaeologically speaking. And with a little the interrupted line that's around kind of the vague Balkan region, and we have there's a bunch of languages in italics tested in the Balkans, but a lot of them are tested in a very fragmentary state, and we really don't quite know what's happening in the Balkans. It's the big black box of Indo-European. We don't really know how everything works out down there. All right, now for the second half of the branches, Baltic and Slavic form a group together. Baltic is very late. It only gets attested in Christian text from about the year 1400 on. It was once a lot more widely spread. Today, only Lithuanian and Latvian remain. It shares some features with Indo-Iranian, interestingly enough. And despite being so late in attestation, it preserves a lot of really cool ancient traits. And like Slavic and the language we just spoke of, it has step ancestry and is part of this Cordillera complex. This hatched region here shows you the area where we find river names that are distinctly Baltic. So Baltic languages were once much more widely spoken, but then they got eclipsed by Slavic. We're not exactly sure where the Slavic speakers come from, maybe from the Carpathians or from the Eastern Baltic, definitely closely allied with Baltic, probably closely related. Features shared with Indo-Iranian, as we already said. Some interactions with Germanic, mostly in historical times, and by ways of genetics and archaeology, also very similar, right? Now, Indo-Iranian, which is what I basically earn my bread working at the moment, very odd branch in a way. The texts are very old indeed, but all the manuscripts are very late. Mostly just because of this, the climate in South Asia, and that a lot of these manuscripts were written on palm leaves, which only last for about 100 years. But the neat thing is that we actually have traces of, a bunch of Indo-Iranian words in cuneiform tablets from the Near East from about 1400 BCE. So that's pretty neat. Indo-Iranian is clearly a binary branch, so it splits off into Indic and Iranic, which are both similar and dissimilar. And Iranic is known for ruling the steppe for a long time, right? It's the earliest kind of language group that we see in the Eurasian steppe. The cool thing about Indo-Iranian is that the grammar is very similar to Greek, which is still to come up, but the sound changes make it really quite divergent from Greek and closer to Balto-Slavic. This is one of those eternal conundrums of Indo-European linguistics. Genetically, we do see steppe ancestry, but it's weaker than we'd think it should be. So that's a bit of a problem we'll talk about later. Archaeologically, it's a lot clearer. We're actually very sure that the Indo-Iranian languages were brought to Central and South Asia by the Santashta and then Andronova cultures, which are descended from the Yamnaya culture, which you're going to hear a bunch more about later on. So that's clear enough. I just teased, before we go to Greek, here you can see in the vertical lines, that's the expanse of Aranek in the Eurasian steppe, from west all the way in Ukraine, all the way east to the Tarim Basin. And in horizontal lines, it's the main Iranic languages spoken today, right? So especially Persian and Pashto you see there. Greek. Greek attestation begins very early, which is really cool. And it has a lot of really ancient traits similar to Indo-Iranian, despite them being far removed geographically and by means of sound changes. Greek is only one language. It's a branch that's its own language, its own branch rather, which is interesting. And it shares features with Armenian and Albanian, which are still coming up, which are also branches with one language each. Kind of similar with Italic, there's not really a clear genetic signal from the steppe for Greek. And Greek archaeology is also very complicated. There's not like a clear throughway in which we know that the Greek speakers got to Greek ultimately. So this is kind of interesting, something more work needs to be done on. Armenian is my personal favorite among the branches of the Indo-European languages. I mean, look at that text. How could you not like that? How can you not like that? Armenian crops up around 500 CE in written attestations. It's only one language again. And we only figured out that it was its own branch of Indo-European very late, because most words in Armenian are Aranek words. They're borrowings from Aranek languages. But we figured out that there was a couple that are inherited Indo-European and very much corresponding regularly, it sounds, to other languages and quite their own kind of thing. And as I said before, features shared with Greek and Albanian. Something might have gone on there in the Balkans, not exactly sure. And as much as I love Armenian and Albanian, they're not going to do a lot of help for us looking for the homeland. The genetics and archaeology are a bit too complicated for that, especially because they're not that widespread. So we're going to have to breeze across them here. Finally, Albanian, the last branch of Indo-European to ever get written down, very late, overlaid with Latin borrowings, linked with Greek and Armenian, a lovely, lovely language, but it's not going to do a lot for the homeland problem. And these 10 branches, although I know I've been talking a lot now just about all these different weird languages that people spoke, but there's actually a bunch more Indo-European languages that are just not as well known, neither by regular folks nor by the scholars, right? There's a bunch of clearly Indo-European languages. We have Phrygian and Macedonian, which are very probably related to Greek, so it's maybe not really a branch of one language. A bunch of languages from the Balkans that are just not attested well enough. It's mostly these inscriptions, as you can see on the screen. And we can't really say what they belong to and how they're related to this or that, the other thing. Masapic from southern Italy, we're not really sure about. Lusitanian, which may or not be a Celtic language. But if it is a Celtic language, that means we have to change our conception of what Celtic actually is to accommodate it. And very much the same with Venetic, which may or may not be Italic. And the list of course, there's a huge amount of languages and branches that probably just were lost before they got written down, right? So that makes the job difficult for us. Now we're finally going to look at the tree of Indo-European, which people are always, everyone wants to see the Indo-European tree all the time. That's what a lot of research and everything's about. Everyone really loves the tree. The thing is, there's not really, there's very little agreement actually on the branching order. Like here are two highly esteemed scholars have completely different ideas of how it worked out. Only the red arrow you can see, both of them agree that Anatolian was the first to split off from the mother language. So there's a lot of contention about this tree. So we're just going to give you like our personal guesstimation. We figure that it's a decent guess, and we have some reasons to believe it's shaped this way. But so, and you can quote us on this, but just know that there's a lot of contention and disagreement in this, right? Proto-Indo-European, the mother of all. First, we're reasonably sure that Anatolian split off. We're not just going to tell you that, we're going to tell you why we think that later on, with all these extinct languages, including Hittite. Then probably Tocharian branching off, two languages aptly called A and B from Western China. Next, for instance, we might think Germanic might have been the next to branch off from the mother language. And Germanic is pretty closely related, as I said before, like, at least geographically, in interactions with Italic, here, Latin and its descendants, and the other languages that Latin eclipsed early on, and Celtic, the insular languages, most of which are alive today, and the extinct continental languages. Then we're going to go, and then these languages, which which are probably share some kind of shared history in the Balkans. We're not exactly sure about that, mostly because there's probably a bunch of languages and even branches that disappeared too quickly. Balto-Slavic, with Baltic, Lithuanian, Latvian, and extinct Old Prussian, and Slavic, which we all know very well. And finally, down here we have Indo-Iranic, splitting up into the Indic languages. I think by the most restrictive counts, we're well over 100, probably several hundred languages, actually. Very interesting area of research, very much still in its infancy. And Aranek, extinct languages of Central Asia, and a bunch of really cool living ones. This is kind of our picture of the whole deal. Like I said, it's not uncontroversial. What people can pretty much agree on these days is that Anatolian will certainly split off first. We're going to go into that, and Decarian second. And most people also agree that Germanic, Italic, and Celtic are probably close in the subgrouping, right? Because they share a bunch of features. Whether these languages in the Balkans were, split off early or late, or whether Indo-Iranic is really that close to Balto-Slavic, people will have differing opinions on. But we figure at least this tree can't be that far from the truth. Subgrouping is, as you just seen from that tree, a very delicate and sensitive kind of affair, and people have been working on it for for about 150 years, since one of the first ever language trees was drawn here in Jena, Germany. And this is just to show you that there's a bunch, the features certain languages share, certain branches share, are never really congruent, So for instance, here in green and red, we have two major groups of Indo-European languages as designated by a key sound change, right? Looking at the word for 100 in the languages in green, it's sound like s or sh. In the others, it isn't. We used to think this was a clear early sign that these are two completely different branches that split off early. Now we don't think that anymore. It seems to be a lot of independent innovations, especially because Tocharian, we used to think it was a west-east split, see? But now Tocharian is the furthest east Indo-European language, but it behaves in this way like the ones of Western Europe. So this is one of the features or one of the traits shared by some languages, but other traits, like something for grammar or which words are used, kind of contradict this to some extent. Just to show you how contentious this idea of subgrouping and so is in Indo-European. All right. Now we've got to know the whole gang, and we know where they all are in time and space and a bunch of details about them. So now let's actually talk about what has been done so far to try and find a homeland, and why it's going pretty well, but why it has also had a lot of problems in the past. This is just like a small selection of some of the more often proposed homelands of Indo-European, right? In more or less Central, Eastern Europe and Western Asia, and the scholars associated with these homelands. This has been going on for a long time. You even have, you have someone putting it in Egypt down there. People have said that it's clearly from the South Pole, but these are some of the more serious homelands. But you see, it's all over the place. So what do we do to propose and find a homeland? It's important that I always have a hot drink because I talk too fast. So I should be sipping more at my tea to make me slow down. All right, some of the methods we're going to talk about here now are center of gravity, linguistic paleontology, comparative poetics, and simply contact with other languages. So if in our written sources, we see that two languages or two branches are interacting, right? They're exchanging words, for instance. We know that they must have been spoken at the same time in the same place, more or less, right? So that's already a pretty big indication, as vague as that may be. And then we're going to talk about, and brief aside, about how languages actually spread. right? Because it's not all as trivial as that. The center of gravity is a principle that's been invoked for a long time for many, many language families. The idea is that the homeland is probably there where the highest diversity of primary branches of this language family is found. For instance, if we look at Austronesian, which is a huge language family spread over a gigantic region, but on Taiwan, we have, I think, every single but one primary subgroup of Austronesian spoken only on Taiwan, and most of them are spoken only at Taiwan. So this is a relatively clear indication that Taiwan was probably the homeland. And this idea has actually been corroborated by all kinds of other evidence. So it's a very powerful tool. If we apply this to Indo-European now, we would probably have something like the center of gravity where we have the most primary branches would probably be somewhere around like the Balkans, where we have, Slavic languages, all these Balkanic languages, Greek, Armenian, Italic nearby. That would be a decent guess. Or we could say Italy maybe. This map just shows you the incredible linguistic diversity of Italy before Latin just flattened everything, right? You can see Latin is still a very small light gray sliver in central Italy here. And not all of these languages are Indo-European actually, but in like Italy, roundabouts Italy and the Balkans, we have the highest density of primary branches, right? So shouldn't that be the homeland? Other points of evidence have not really corroborated that. It's kind of, you can't really explain Indo-European as coming, in linguistics, genetics, and archaeology from Italy or the Balkans, right? So this method has worked very well for Austronesian, Niger-Congo, which is pretty much like the super family within which the Bantu languages, which we've heard about earlier are. For Athabascan, it's worked wonderfully. For Indo-European, not that much. Should be Italy or the Balkans. But it's never, to my mind, never really been seriously considered in the past decades. So we're jumping ahead here a little bit, but let's say, what if the homeland was on the Eurasian steppe? Now, the steppe is what we call a spread zone. So it's a region that has constant migrations, expansions by certain population groups, and all of this serves to kind of obfuscate the historical signal, right? There's just too much happening in the steppe. People don't settle in any given place for very long. And when they do, unfortunately, they've tended to historically not leave written sources, right? So am I being a big old wuss and saying, oh, Indo-European doesn't, it's different, we're special, or maybe a center of gravity doesn't work for everything, right? This is the thing we're going to see a lot when we talk about these methods, is that all of these methods are very powerful, but not all of them work equally well for all languages, right? Good thing that we have more methods in our metaphorical hat. Now, linguistic paleontology is, I think, a kind of subdiscipline or method that's pretty intuitive, like it's pretty commonsensical, it's not very highly technical. The basic idea of it is that if the Indo-Europeans had a word for something, they must have had the thing, right? And what I mean, if the Indo-Europeans have the word, of course, what we do is we look at words from different languages and see that, if we find these words spread well across a bunch of these branches of Indo-European and corresponding regularly, then we can probably assume, well, this word they all inherited this word from a common ancestor, right? Like the words for water, seven, and cow that we saw earlier, they're all related through regular sound correspondences. So it's a very, we can pretty much assume that Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European had the word. So far, so good. And for instance, over the past 120 or so years, we've reconstructed a lot of pretty refined vocabulary about wheels and wheeled vehicles, dairy and milk production, and wool. So this could give us some good information about how the European subsistence culture, how they lived and what they lived off of. In case you see my eyes wandering off, it's because there is a deluge happening in Jena right now. And I'm just, I wonder if we'll get out of this alive. Fingers crossed, eh? All right, and of course we can also use this from elements of the natural world, right? Traditionally, especially like the words for beech tree and beaver and salmon have been used because these all reconstruct very well to Proto-Indo-European. We find words for beech tree and salmon that are that correspond regularly. on the level of sounds in many languages. So we could say, well, Proto-Indo-Europeans must have lived somewhere where they had beech trees and salmons. Makes sense, but this whole method is a bit problematic, of course, because, I mean, for relatively simple reasons. If historically, if an Indo-European group has, migrated to an area where there are no beech trees, they would often just use the word for beech tree and just apply it to something else, like an oak tree or an elm tree. And if they don't have salmons, they might as well just use the word salmon because they have the word, right? They inherited it. They're just going to use it for any kind of fish or a different kind of fish. So we have to be a bit careful here and not put too much weight on any one single word, right? We can't necessarily exclude regions that have no beech trees, for instance, for the Indo-European homeland. Now, we talked about the wheeled vehicles. This lovely map of all the, or again, of most of the Indo-European branches, Armenian and Albanian always have a hard time, shows us some words regarding wheeled vehicles, wagons or chariots. And the little diagrams show you that, the single language branches, how many of those words and which ones they have, right? We have two different words for wheel, a word for axle, a word for thill. If you've heard the word thill before, if you could have defined the word thill before today's lecture, then I guess props to you. I'll get you a coffee or something. And we can see here that this vocabulary was pretty much shared everywhere, but Anatolian and Tocharian are the odd ones out, right? Tocharian only has the word for wheel, clearly attested, the Indo-European word for wheel, that is the inherited one. And Anatolian doesn't have that either. It only has this one word for thill, which actually means oar, and like as in, like an oar used for rowing in Anatolian. So they're weird here. They don't seem to have inherited this wagon vocabulary, or this chariot vocabulary the other branches have. Here's the same thing again in table form. We've got some of our main branches and these words for wheel, thill, axle, and to transport in a vehicle, to drive, as it were. Yeah, Anatolian and Tocharian, they're kind of missing a lot up there. Then we have Celtic, Italic, and Greek, which are all nice, hoary, old forms of, or old language branches. They have 3 each. They have the word for axle and for drive and 1 word for wheel. But then really Germanic, Balto-Slavic, and Indoiranian have a lot more. Indoiranian actually has all these 5 sets. Germanic, I always think Germanic is really cool that it's so late, but it has 4 of them, including the 2 different words for wheel, right? That's just Germanic being cool. So what people assume is probably that Anatolian and Tocharian simply split off from the mother language before this, well, not necessarily before the wheel was developed or anything, but before a refined vocabulary around the wheel and wheeled vehicles was developed. Again, this can't stand on its own and explain everything, but it's another indication, right? We also have this wonderful wool vocabulary, the word for wool. Here's a bunch of different forms of words for wool in different languages, which all reconstruct, regularly to this bit of a monster you see up top, this kind of algebraic formula, the word for wool. So it looks like it's a very nicely inherited word, which it is. However, ultimately, it might just be one of those ancient loan words, because we have very similar looking words in Sumerian and Akkadian, which is a Semitic language, and Northeast Caucasian languages for wool. So this might also be one of those old kind of agricultural words that moves around a lot and gets transferred to other families in early prehistory. Not all that easy. All right. Now we looked at the wheel and wool, and grain vocabulary is a bit, it's not quite as easy. Right on the left, you see a bunch of roots for different types of grains, and then in the different languages, what kind of grains designates, right? Is it wheat, barley, rye, millet, or is it maybe just like generally grain or corn, right? And this is a pretty scrappy kind of picture. The roots are pretty unevenly portioned, and seem to often mean different things. Like, any one root can often mean, just grain or wheat or barley in different languages. So it seems like it all seems a little bit sus, right? It's not really that clear that Indo-European had designated names for these different kinds of grain. At least there's no easy picture that develops, right? So probably they were just reusing a lot of basic words they have, for this or that or the other grain. Now, to sum up our discussion of linguistic paleontology, it seems fairly clear that Indo-Europeans were probably pastoralists who used some kinds of wagons or chariots, and were probably not primarily agriculturalists. This thing about the grain words doesn't mean that they definitely had no agriculture, but just at least primarily they were probably not concerned with that, because the vocabulary around stuff like dairy is a lot clearer, right? It's clearer that they all inherited the same words. So this was clearly like a major thing that their ancestor engaged in, right? Also from the real vocabulary, it seems Anatolian and probably then Tocharian separated off early before this technology was developed fully. But like I've said a bunch of times now, linguistic paleontology alone cannot really serve to give us a homeland, right? We can exclude some things, we can push the argument in a certain direction, right? That Europeans probably had this certain type of subsistence and not this other one. But we also have to look at the other evidence, of which there is plenty. Very briefly, just because it's so cool, I need to talk to you about comparative poetics, which is actually in its sophisticated state that it has now a very recent kind of method. So many Indo-European poetic traditions reference a similar kind of culture. Like you find this in the old Irish texts, you find it in Greek with Homer, you find it in the Vedic hymns in India. A kind of culture which is a lot of it's about young groups of men banding together, being warlike and gaining fame for doing cattle raids, and there's fire rituals. So pretty specific kind of thing already, right? And the importance of horses too. But not only this kind of vague picture of a society, but also a lot of poetic formulas themselves are actually retained as is in multiple branches. For instance, this phrase in Vedic, which is basically a form of Sanskrit from South Asia. Yeah, this phrase Shravasakshittam, meaning undying fame. It's something you want to win if you're a young Indo-European, probably. And it equals the Greek phrase Chleros Aftiton, sound for sound, like every single sound it corresponds regularly. So these two languages, at least, clearly inherited one phrase and just over the centuries treated the sounds a bit differently. This is really cool. There's other phrases. For instance, there's this idea of myths of slaying a serpent to release the waters, right? In Vedic, this is the phrase is ahan ahin, he slew the serpent. In Greek, the same pretty much is elpip noopin, so slew the serpent. This is pretty cool. This tells us some things about Indo-European, and not necessarily that much about the homeland, but we can infer that, right, that cattle raids are important, and horseback riding. Now, having said all that, this is maybe trivial to some extent, but we do need to consider that languages do not necessarily equate with material cultures, which we all should know, and also that to move a language, we don't necessarily need to do a lot. It doesn't necessarily have to be an invasion or a migration, as has often been assumed, right? So, as you've probably seen in some of the other case studies already, including Bantu, languages often spread with agricultural revolutions, right? Be that the advent of agriculture in itself, or something like, refined millet agriculture, right? That often spreads languages incredibly fast. We have many, many cases of that. We don't need a massive population movement. All we need is this technology or this cultural traits to spread to people to adopt it, and then adopt the language with it. That helps us spread a language very fast and very far without having massive population replacements, right? And people can also marry into what we might call an evolutionarily successful group, or just adopt their culture, right? No population movements required. For instance, Pashto in Afghanistan and Pakistan has been successful over a couple of centuries now, evolutionarily successful, I mean, not by invading or anything, but simply because they have a very egalitarian and very practical method of apportioning land to people in a village, right? So people living next to Pashto settlements see this and, you know, tend to adapt it or want to marry into this, this society, which is this has this really cool egalitarian way of treating land property. And, you know, and if they have the chance to marry into it, they'll probably do it. And also the fact that this is such a successful subsistence strategy basically promotes Pashto as, you know, Pashtunwali as a culture, Pashto as a language, right? Now, mounted steppe warriors, as the Indo-Europeans might have been, are historically very bad actually at spreading their languages, more so than you might expect. So like, for instance, the Bulgars, the Mongols, Manchus, Normans, Lombards, and many others all failed to actually spread their language because they were just a very small group of people conquering another people. And at some point, these, you know, these mounted steppe warriors all assumed the language of the common people. However, what we might call elite dominance has managed to spread some languages in the past. For instance, the Turkic languages were mostly spread, again, not by you know, not by necessarily by invasion or by spreading population, but, you know, small Turkic-speaking elites have managed quite successfully to basically to promote their language to others, right? Similar with Hungarian, Hungarian prehistory, if you're interested in that. All right. Okay, now we've talked a lot of past ideas and how or how not to do stuff, and we've done a lot of talking about caution. So now I'm going to give it back to Rasmus to really get us right to 2021 and tell us what the state of the art is and what we think right now about the homeland problem. Take it away.
Thanks a lot, Rob, for providing that background, which is essential for understanding how the different positions still line up. And I saw you, Marvin, had a comment. I will be including that in one of the next slides. So there is still a fuss in 2021, but let's be focusing on what the fuss is all about and not all these old questions that we can now depart from. Just need to make sure that, okay, right. So we're back to the homeland problem. And in the 1990s, we actually had, you saw the different homelands that were proposed, but actually scholarly consensus started to settle on one or two propositions. Either the steppe zone, as we heard from Gimbutas, the archaeologist, was very prominent in tying Proto-Indo-European with the Kurgan, phenomenon, and opposing that, Anatolia, Armenia, where another archaeologist, Renfrew, published a book in the late 80s called Archaeology and Language, suggesting that indeed Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European languages was spread with agriculture, which coming from Anatolia. Both of these ideas are still relevant, but for different reasons, and we'll get to that. So if we had to like have a boxing fight, which we pretty much did up until 10 years ago, we would put in one corner Gimbutas, Anthony, another archaeologist, and Mallory, who we've sourced a lot of the maps from, also an archaeologist in one corner with a lot of different linguists, but primarily this is actually an archaeologist's appraisal, where we would say Indo-European spread by chariot riding, pastoralists from Eurasian steppe. And in the other corner, you would have the Anatolia Armenia team with Renfrew, who's an archaeologist, but then some prominent linguists as well, Gamkhlitz and Ivanov and Dolgopolsky, saying that Indo-European spread by agriculturalists from the Near East. And that's pretty much the environment I started studying Indo-European in, because that predates the revolution in ancient DNA. So if we look at archaeology from the vantage point of the steppe zone, we can have Yamnaya at the heart of it all, also known as the Kurgan theory. So we see how it spread east and west, and it covers many of the branches of Indo-European at roughly the right time zone. And then going a bit, this is just going forward in time. After in the first year, we see Afanasyevo, which is the early branching with Tocharian. And then secondarily, we see here Indoiranian spreading with Sintashta and Dronovo, and then obviously all the European branches spreading further here, particularly Celtic into far Western Europe. The alternative proposal would have it spread with agriculture, which also went east and west. So that would also account for some of the branches. So genetically, the problem was, so genetics have been known far longer than 10 years. The problem was that looking at modern populations in Europe, we saw three components. We could fix the blue one as a European one, so that's the hunter-gatherers, so they were there from time immemorial. And we could fix what we see here as the orange component as early Neolithic, so that would be the argument for the out of Anatolia, because we could still see in modern day populations in the Middle East that component was there, so there's a connection. But we also knew there was, or people knew, that there was a third component, but we did not know where it came from. And it was only with the advent of ancient DNA that we could tie that to Yamnaya, because there's no specific trait in the steppe zone where Yamnaya was spoken, exactly because there has been so much movement back and forth. So it's not been demographically stable as the Middle East has been in comparative terms, of course. So that's the big breakthrough that we did see. And we've seen this map earlier during the summer school, and we see how it fits many and actually most of the Indo-European branches. So we now get the steppe hypothesis confirmed with both archaeology and genetics. And this is from one of the pioneering papers. This one is from Allentoft. We also had Hack et al. In 2015, and that's right when both Rob and I were studying in the European studies. So obviously this had a huge, was a massive breakthrough in how we could view the landscape in which Proto-Indo-European and Indo-European branches were spreading. And coincidentally, we see the same thing happening with the microbiomes, which we've also been introduced to. So again, this is not a linguistic argument per se, but it corroborates the idea that yes, we have an early migration to the east with Tocharian. You can see that in the top picture. And then there's separation, and then we get 1,000 years later or so, we get Aranek speaking peoples coming in and getting back into contact with the Tocharian. So a lot of things just adding up really nicely, why a lot of people have come together to support this, the steppe hypothesis for parts of the story. So as I just said, all branches, apart from Anatolia, now convincingly tied to populations with genetic ancestry in the Yamnaya culture. We see this both with human and bacterial spread. So it explains very neatly how languages in a relatively shallow time frame, because we need to have these vehicles and we need to have a lot of other cultural terms spreading. Sorry, the vehicle is only partial for Tocharian, of course, but it explains it really, really nicely. And we've also talked about language contact in terms of Tocharian, needing it to be somewhat northern. And again, while Indoiranian doesn't have a very strong signal, and genetically there is still one, but we have a very strong linguistic signal. So even though maybe we may not sure about the genetic component, we're so sure about the linguistic component, tying it to all the languages that we need to have in the steppe zone, that by proxy we also need to have Indoiranian in the steppe zone in that period of time. So that has even prompted Renfrew, who published the book with these Anatolian origins, to concede a lot of the argument to Gimbutas, unfortunately after her death, but that's just how the cookie crumbles sometime. But she has been, in a sense, vindicated in this debate that a large part of the migrations actually did depart from the central steppe zone. So, and slightly differently is Johanna Nichols, another very prominent linguist, who had her own idea that Proto-Indo-European should have spread from Central Asia, and by linguistic arguments alone, these cultural, what we call linguistic paleontology, and she's specific about the article that convinced her, also said, okay, there is so much evidence, and this is from before we even had the aDNA breakthrough, that we could agree on the steppe homeland. So that's where all these steps are being made. Right. So, but there is still a big problem today, and we cannot abandon Anatolia altogether. but we need to focus on where the debate should be had. So as we said, we can check off archaeology, genetics, and linguistics, and with pastoralism, real vehicles, and the step for the majority of the Indo-European branches. But we cannot explain all of the branches because Anatolian is challenging, as we have seen. There's not a clear vehicle vocabulary there. There's no genetics there. So did we solve the tree? Well, anything below it, we can now start to put in proper order. Again, more granularity is needed in terms of genetics. We can revisit all the linguistic data to figure out like who split first, Germanic or Italic or Celtic, and there are a lot of contact phenomena going on. So still a lot of things that needs to be settled, but generally anything below the red line, we can fix in the Yamnaya region because of genetics, archaeology, and linguistics combined. For some of the branches, all three just ticks. For some of them, maybe just two of them, but then they're so strongly connected through a linguistic evidence that we can't ignore that, and we can come up with rather easy explanations for why, say, genetics doesn't click or why archaeology is mixed up, as we've seen in all the other different cases that it is not always clear, like directly connected genetics, language, and archaeology. So the issue is at the top. Anatolian origins. So it can be a little bit confusing because we have a branch called Anatolian, and it's called Anatolian because it was spoken only in Anatolia, which is pretty much modern day Turkey, and it's an extinct branch. But we don't have sister branches that are close to it outside of Anatolia. So we know that it's autochthonous there. So we know that it was the first one to branch off, as we've seen in pretty much every family tree that we have, and we know that from linguistic evidence. So there are special semantic developments, and there's a verbal system that acts very differently, but if we reconstruct it back to a common stage, where Anatolian develops in one direction and the rest, so a common ancestor for the rest of the Indo-European languages develop in a different direction, we can account for all of it. As we said, the real vocabulary doesn't work for Proto-Anatolian, and the genetic evidence is also missing. The Yamnaya ancestry is not evident in Anatolia. So basically, we're back to the two propositions. We're back in the ring, but now only discussing where was the earliest iteration of Proto-Indo-European spoken, south or north of the Caucasus. So going with the first proposition that was spoken north of the Caucasus, that was basically just the earlier version of Yamnaya. It was still spoken on the steppe. You would have to answer to the genetic problem. And as we've already talked about, there are some ways that we could do that. We could say elite dominance. Then genetic signal can be lost rather quickly, and we're looking at several millennia of development and intermarrying. So that could be diluted pretty quickly. Also, the ancient Anatolians practiced cremation a lot, and I saw it written somewhere that they hit the bones. So it's difficult for archaeologists and archaeogeneticists to find those bones and provide that analysis. And even if they do, there is this chance of elite dominance and so much dilution that the Yamnaya traits are completely lost. And there's even Anthony, who's one of the prominent archaeologists who's working on this, has pointed to a very early migration out of the steppe zone, so from basically Yamnaya into Balkan, where we see in prestige graves in, I think this is the Varna cemetery in modern day Bulgaria. We see the steppe ancestry only in the elite graves and nowhere else. The commoners are not, don't have any of this, and this is already very, very early. So it wouldn't take very many more centuries or not to say millennia for the trait to be completely gone. And then there's some linguistic indicators saying that, well, there's not linguistic continuity in Anatolia in the sense that we have a lot of unrelated languages in ancient Anatolia, especially only in the east. We don't know much about the west. where we don't see early Indo-European loans, for example, into Semitic. And then there's a question of borrowed lexicon in the other direction, into the steppe zone, which is something I'm working on, but a lot of more debate and fine details still have to be discussed there. But the basic argument goes that if Proto-Indo-European borrowed words from the Balkans, and those words are also present in Anatolian, then they must have been present there together, where for Anatolian must have been spoken in the steppe. So that's proposition A. And then there's proposition B, it rhymes, but it's proposition B, which is that Anatolian was actually spoken in Anatolian, meaning that Proto-Indo-European with Anatolian was spoken in Anatolian, so that the rest of the Indo-European languages had migrated to Yamnaya, where we need them to be. And this is a possibility as well. So David Reich, the famous Harvard geneticist, in his famous book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, says that, well, in his opinion, and looking at genetics, it makes sense that it derived from south of the Caucasus Mountains, because that would genetically provide a source population both for the Yamnaya and the ancient Anatolians. This alludes to the fact that Yamnaya ancestry is based on two components. It's based on one from south of the Caucasus, which would make very much sense here, and one from the steppe zone, but further east. And here we're very far back into prehistory, so it's very difficult because we don't have a lot of further linguistic signals there. But that's part of this argument. And then there's also some linguistic arguments being proposed, but this is very much in its infancy. This is a very recent lecture by Petra Godegebude from Chicago. She's a specialist in the Anatolian languages. And she is pointing to the fact that the word for wine was not borrowed in a particular order and direction. So her conclusion is that Anatolian citizens are spoken to the east. I can pick that a little bit apart. I would love to have that discussion with her at some point, but just to say, this is where the discussion is being had. Where was Proto-Indo-European with Anatolian being spoken? And then there are a lot of other fun questions. So if you have insights to this, please come and join us. This is where the big question is at right now. But there are other fun questions, and we do have time to introduce them, fortunately. And I have, with all the new answers that we have, we also get these new questions. And I've alluded to some of these in my earlier talk with Zakarian and Afanasievo. But the thing is that Afanasievo is located around the Minnesota Basin, which is close to the Altai-Sayan region, so in southern Siberia. But that's not where the Tigrian languages are actually found. When they show up in the written record, they show up in the Tarim Basin. So that's pretty far south, from a direct line south. And there's also a clear route that they could have taken. But we actually don't have a clear picture of how that was. But as I've already said on an earlier occasion, these language contacts have helped us understand that they were in a northern zone, because that's where you find Uralic and Turkic, and further away Mongolic and also Chinese. And these interfaces, which are being studied right now, will give us dates and place for both early Tocharian and early stages of these other language families. So truly exciting times, and I hope that some of you will join us in learning more. But I will leave the floor now to Rob indefinitely and say thank you for me, and take it away, Rob.
All right, yeah, we have a couple minutes left, so I figure I'll talk to you briefly about this Indo-Iranian problem. So what we know about Indo-Iranian getting into Central and Southern Asia is that around about the same time, the Harappan, also known as Indus civilization, and the BMAC, also known as Oxus civilization, kind of just disappear, which has always been framed as in, the Indo-Iranians are probably just going down there and destroying these civilizations and conquering them, right? We also know that, as I said before, Aranek, specifically, the languages of the Saka, are pretty much, that's the first really historically attested lingua franca of much of the steppe, right? there's some decent evidence that that the Indo-Europeans, Proto-Europeans themselves might have been like the first overlords of the steppe, as it were, simply because they were probably the first population group to develop really horseback riding and chariot riding on like a major level. But that's as maybe. So and we know about Aranek and about Indic. So how do we get to South Asia? Now, archaeology shows us pretty well that the Andronovo culture, which you might remember from earlier, is a descendant of the Sintashta culture, which in turn is a descendant of the Yamnaya culture of the Western Steppe. We know that this Andronovo culture, which is pretty soundly associated with Indo-Iranic speakers, interacted with this Oxus culture, also called the BMAC, which stands for Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, which was an urban culture, as opposed to this kind of pastoralist, semi-nomadic Andronovo culture. We know they interacted, and we know that when the Oxus culture disappeared, which it did, the Andronovo kind of material culture kind of passed right through and further to Southern Asia, right? This has been, historically taken as a sign of invasion, of warfare, but because we have, by now, the archaeology of Central Asia is very well studied, and we have no real evidence at all for any kind of warfare. Rather, it looks like the Indo-Iranians, they were probably more partners of the Oxus civilization, right? So they were probably peripheral traders and mercenaries. They might have been, or they were probably involved in the tin trade, which is just one possibility, because tin trade is actually, turns out to be a major thing in prehistory. And when their urban partners just kind of floundered, disappeared, they went south looking for greener pastures and new cultures to partner with. The Oxus civilization is pretty clearly not Indo-European, and genetically it's pretty close to the Near East. And it probably got a lot of these, let's say, civilized loans, by which I mean regarding brick building and rituals into Indo-Iranic. Here you have Andronovo tribes hatched, then the Central Asian towns, which is the same as Oxus culture or BMAC in Central Asia, and then further down you have the Indus civilization, another early urban civilization, and rather small, the Gandhara grave culture, which is one of the early material cultures of South Asia associated, it has been associated with Indo-Iranic. Here you have Gandhara grave again, cemetery age and painted greyware, which are all material cultures that have been connected with early Indic languages, specifically in South Asia. And also it's around the Indus region, the Punjab region, where the Vedic texts are also situated, basically, right? And that's all easy enough. Iranic languages seem to have remained in the steppe after Indic passed through the Oxus civilization and went into South Asia. Iranic then later spread onto the Iranian plateau. I mean, that's how it got its name, right? That's how the name Iran came about, because that's where the Iranians, or many, lived. But the Eastern Iranic languages, or specifically, the Saka, continued to dominate the steppe for many centuries, right? We know that very well from historiography. The Persians and Medes are both attested as invaders coming into the Iranian plateau in Akkadian texts from the very early 1st century BCE. So that's pretty well historically attested when they show up there. That's Western Iranic, Persian, and Median. An odd thing is that steppe DNA, or rather this, this Yemenite DNA, is not very prominent in South Asia. It's definitely there, but it's limited pretty much to the northern region and most common in high caste males. So this could simply mean that that they were not a very large group that did not leave a very strong genetic imprint. So maybe there was some kind of elite dominant situation going on, rather than wholesale population replacement, which might have happened in Europe, giving us that Germanic speakers actually have some of the highest degrees of steppe DNA, right? That's just what I, as a linguist, as not a specialist in these matters, can say. But the weird thing is that there was a continuous population movement from Central to Southern Asia, basically starting around 2000 BCE. And South Asian history is actually really, really interesting and really, really understudied. It's really cool, but we would actually expect probably more kind of steppe DNA, or it might have come in late. So why is there so little steppe DNA? And even Aranek speakers, Also, they show a lot of, nowadays show a lot of, and also historically, show a lot of Near Eastern DNA, this kind of South Asian cline associated with Western Asian farmers, which is a bit odd, not as much their DNA as we'd expect. So that's all, that all is, makes it, yeah, archaeology is pretty clear, linguistics are pretty clear, genetics is not yet really giving us tools to really, to close the, to close the case on Indo-Iranic, but a lot of that might just be, maybe in a year from now already we'll have better specimens, better samples, and better research in these areas. Just very briefly, we do need to stress the fact that when we're talking about Proto-Indo-European, we're not talking about like some primeval language that humans spoke, right? It's about as far back as linguists can go, but basically in terms of prehistory, this is all very recent prehistory. We're talking a late Bronze Age here mostly, right? So this is pretty recent history. So by the time Indo-European languages made it to Europe, and indeed to South and Western Asia, there were already people speaking languages there that had been for tens of thousands of years, right? Indo-European languages interacted with these local languages, which we can call substrates, right? And we can see that by a lot of loans in these in the single branches which are not Indo-European. These people would have been both hunter-gatherers, especially in Northern Europe, and also the first farmers, especially around the Mediterranean. And Basque, for instance, which is famous for being the only large language isolate of Europe, it's quite probably descended from these earlier pre-Indo-European groups, right? And again, this is not really anything really exotic or weird. It's a relatively recent prehistory we're talking about. We know about a bunch of these languages. They're not completely mysterious. We have 1, 2, maybe even 3 languages in Sicily that are not Indo-European. We have them in Iberia. Aquitania, we have some sources on, which is probably the ancestor of Basque. And for instance, Etruscan, which was once the dominant language of central Italy, actually was, by the time, Rome and Latin were still very much in their infancy, it was a dominant language there. So we actually have a lot of loans from Etruscan into Latin, which then come into English, like histrionic, for instance, right? Histrio is actor in Latin, that's from Etruscan. So interesting languages that are just, often we kind of lack sources to know about that, but stuff was happening in Europe, right? And as we've said before, we have these fragmentary Indo-European languages, which are often not very well studied simply because our inscriptions that we have are not very plentiful. More may show up, like for instance, in Hittite even, we're still actively, there's actually a backlog of editing Hittite texts, right? So who knows, with time, we may know more about these languages and how they relate to each other. And maybe genetics and archaeology can maybe also help us out a little bit with our picture of pre-Indo-European Europe. All right, thank you all for sticking around with us so far. We've now given you a bit of a tour de force through the Proto-Indo-European homeland, Indo-European, and how we come up with the homeland, and what we think is the state of affairs at the moment right now. And I hope everyone talk about Indo-European. Everyone likes to have a spicy take on it, and we would like to leave you with knowing that there has been progress. We've been honing in on a bunch of things. A lot of things are abundantly clear because we have different linguistic strands of evidence and genetic and archaeological evidence all kind of converging in certain regions. We can't explain everything yet. As Rasmus said earlier, we have a bunch of problems, especially with the ultimate origin of Indo-European. But basically, we have some pretty good hypotheses now. Any new hypotheses, which would be to replace them, would need to do a better job at explaining more of these disparate populations in different times, different areas, speaking different languages. And I think we have a pretty decent view of the whole thing right now. But we're completely honest saying that we don't have the final answers yet. And we hope that there will be more work in the future. And we'd be really, really glad to discuss this, maybe any ideas, comments, suggestions, or questions you might have immediately now. Just regarding further reading, we have suggested some things here. There's a book by Mallory, which is of course rather old, but it gives a very nice and very readable, Rasmus is holding it up right now. It gives a very readable and very pleasant overview of the linguistics and archaeology as it was known back then, which is, you know, it's a pretty good book. It has a lot of really great maps that you've been seeing throughout the presentation. We also endorsed the book by David Anthony, which is also a bit dated by now, but also gives a really good take on the whole idea. And from like the more modern papers, we're kind of suggesting this paper by Narasimhan, because it's very recent, has a lot of really cool new specimens and a lot of, yeah, this really cool new evidence. If you want anything more, feel free to hit us up. And I think we just about made it through. And I think we're more or less on time. Are we? Oh yeah, I think we've done nicely. So yeah, we're gonna take questions, comments, suggestions, etc. Now I think Rasmus and I were probably gonna, you know, throw them back and forth a little bit to take the heat off each other. But yeah, I think we have a pretty full chat box already.